Shut up, compressor. Hey everyone, Matt here with Duke's Models, and welcome to episode 3 of the 148 scale 3D printed TIE Interceptor build. Now, in the first two installments, the focus was on cleaning this thing up from its 3D printing, getting it primed, and getting it painted. And now that it's painted, we can move into detailing and weathering. Yay! For that, we're going to start in the rather sloppily painted cockpit. Now, my plan for this is to use a very lazy way to detail this up a little bit, mainly because once you have the blast shield thing in the lower half here, and once you have the canopy frame and the clear acetate installed into it, you are not going to see much of anything in here. So, with that in mind, I am going to be doing an aqua gloss wash consisting of aqua gloss, water, and Tamiya rubber black. This is such a great general purpose thing for anything that has raised detail like you see in here. And I'm honestly considering using it as sort of a general thing for the TIE Interceptor overall, but I think it'll make a lot of sense in here to help pop out some of those details and give a hint of a lot more going on than there really is. So basically, all you do is get a brush wet with it, and you just brush it on. And the aqua gloss levels very well, and so it finds the high points and the low points and the various nooks and crannies between all the detail, and it just kind of deposits your highly thinned paint right where you want it to go. It's very hard to show on camera because I can't actually look down the barrel of this thing and see what I'm doing at the same time. So yeah, if you have not used this before, it is a fantastic, very lazy way out of things like gear bays, or honestly things like 3D prints, shut up compressor, fabric texture, things where you have a lot of very finely raised detail that can really benefit from a bit of extra relief, a bit of extra contrast. This stuff just works like magic. It'll go in here. It may look harsh right now, but as it dries, it will soften out. I'm going to give that a few minutes, and then I'll move on to the other sections, because otherwise it will drain and it will look all fucked up. Alright, after a vigorous bout of masking, it's time to go ahead and paint these latches up front and the surrounds for the ion engines in the back with some MRP Gunship Gray 36118. This is not going to be the end of these things. So the thing I'm trying to watch out for here is when you look at the windscreen frame, on most ties you see it substantially darker, right? And this is darker, but not substantially so. Oh, I guess substantially so from certain angles. But from some angles, it just looks a little tiny bit darker. So what I'm going to do next is load up an airbrush with some hairspray. Make sure it sprays. And then we're going to go ahead and hit these. The fuck was that? It's weird, this shit is dusting like a lacquer that hasn't been thin enough, but it's hairspray. Put a little tiny bit of water in here. I've never had that happen before, ever. Okay, it seems to be happier now. Let's try that again. Okay, let that dry. Let's come back here. Alright, so now that the hairspray is dried, I've gone ahead and taken the gunchip gray and added a bit of night camo black to give a sort of Euro 1 gray type of darkness to this. More contrast. That looks more contrasty. Now, if this chipping fails, I might just go back and just paint them gray, and then we can weather it from there. But I'm hoping to get a little bit of chippy goodness going on. I can zoom in a little bit on this so you can see it better. Relatively loose grip I've got going on here. Okay, I'm going to call that reasonably well chipped. Hard to get a bunch to show up on this really dark tone, but I also don't want this thing to look like a derelict, so what can you do? And then with everything unmasked, here's where we end up, with a nice, darker, contrasty canopy frame. Now, this is where the fun begins. It's time to move into pin washes. And so I'm going to start out with some ABT 502 Starship Filth. I've already got some laid out here on the dental pad. Right there. Got a bit of a kind of a dirty wash thing going here already. And I've got a clean little tattoo ink cup full of VMS Universal Weathering Carrier, which I love for pin washes. So how this works is pretty simple. Get a little bit of this stuff. Pick up a little bit of oil, get it wet again. Make sure it's kind of to a flowy place. And then all that you do, you just dab and kind of let it flow. This could flow a little bit more, honestly, but and then as this dries, we come back and clean up those little spots, which is very easy to do. I find myself generally preferring to use the oils and sort of this dipping method as opposed to using pre-made washes, just because, I don't know, it feels like it helps keep a bit more interesting of a variety going on in terms of the dilution rate and all that stuff. And I find that oils are easier to clean up than the primarily enamel washes that are on the market. And the fun thing is we can keep going with just this one little dip until we really need to get more. And you get more, just pick up a tiny little bit. Dab it in, and there it goes, off to the races. One fun thing about the tie is there's a lot of surface detail here. There is a lot of washing to happen and a lot of ground to cover. So this is going to take about 6 years. Good thing is it's great for catching up on podcasts, audiobooks like all of War and Peace and the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy and the Silmarillion, Cryptonomicon, Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I'm trying to name all the longer books that I'm instantly familiar with. Basically, I'm trying to say this takes a while, so it takes a bit of patience. It's not the quick and dirty glory of a sludge wash, but I find that it generally leaves a more consistent, less overall messy finish than just slathering shit on and then removing it. And since the tie has all this little fine surface detail, getting in there to remove stuff can be a bit dicey. So one of the trickier bits of getting this thing pin washed is all these little lines on the forward triangles of the wings. Because they're very long and there's really nowhere to hide. It's not like on the center spar over here where you can, stuff a lot of stuff in there and get it kind of dirty and it looks fine. Out on these things, every little thing shows. And these little ledges here are not deep, so you kind of have to float the oil over them. And it just, again, takes a shitload of time. Alright, after what seems like forever, I'm done with the pin wash. And as you can see on this one, I got a little bit sloppy and impatient toward the end. Good news is that pin washes wash off. Or wipe off. It's probably a better term for it. So let's move back to this wing because it's drier. Basically, it's a matter of taking Q-tips. Just making sure that we get into these areas and remove the excess wash. Nothing particularly fancy about it. Because there is so much raised detail on the TIE Interceptor, it really does a number on Q-tips. So I'll probably be tearing through quite a number of them on this fun excursion here. So as it comes out of the pin wash and gets wiped down, it starts looking like this. Bunch of nice shadow detail and contrast and all that kind of stuff going on. Kicks up the gray, makes it a bit more interesting. And then I obviously need to wait for this to dry up just a little bit more before I get in there and start tackling it. And as you can see on this side, some of that wash lightens up considerably. So yeah. Anyway, let's move on to the cockpit ball, which has also gotten its pin wash, and it was a little bit messier in places. And somehow, I don't really know how, this thing has developed a crack here and a crack here. I think it might have to do with hollowing it out for printing. So if/when I print another one of these, I think I've got enough experience under my belt now to know what I need to do to print it solid and not have it all go to shit. And something that's been a huge help with that is having some flexible build plates for the 3D printers that basically you attach like a magnetic pad to the build plate, and then you attach these flexible steel sheets to those, and those serve as your build surface. And then when you're done, you pop them off, and you can kind of bend them with your hands, and larger prints just pop right off. And the cool thing about that is I don't have to worry about the burn-in layers at the base welding themselves to the rigid metal of the build plate. If they burn themselves into anything, they burn themselves into a steel plate that you can then bend, and they just come right off. So I can increase that burn-in layer time pretty substantially, and that will ensure that the base at least sticks to the build plate, and then everything else from there, I'm starting to get it more sorted out. So whereas I was having all these failed prints when I first started, and that led me to, among other things, hollowing out my TIE Interceptor cockpit balls to get it lighter and have less suction on the FEP and the resin vat and all that kind of thing. I think now I could probably pull this off without it, and that would be great for overall cleanup. I don't have to worry about resin leaks or any of that kind of stuff. Would also be great for this whole cracking thing, because I don't think a solid one could crack. So anyway, you get a sense what's going on here with cleaning up the pin wash, and we're going to have a nice, fun, dirty cockpit ball here. And if it looks a little bit stark, that's because right now it is. That will be dealt with future oils, with clear coats, and various weathering. So I'm going to hop off and finish wiping this thing down with Q-tips over and over and over again, and we'll pick back up momentarily. So after close to a week of work at the bench, I'm pretty much done with the pin wash. It's been applied, it's been removed and cleaned up, and we have some nice contrast and shadow type detail going on the wings and on the cockpit ball. And so now it is time to go ahead and seal all this goodness in. And for that, I'm going to be using some MRP 126 Super Clear Semi-Matte Varnish. Semi-matte is kind of like halfway between dead flat and semi-gloss. I kind of equate it to like satin, but maybe even not quite that. First, I'm going to go ahead and the inside of the cockpit. And so if I'm not feeling like this is doing it, I can always come back over this with some straight up matte coat and really kill the sheen. Okay, so I'm swapping out the semi-matte, which was too sheeny for my taste, for some straight up super clear matte varnish, MRP 127. This stuff isn't as dead flat as like GX 113, but it's pretty damn close. Well, you get what's going on. And now that the flat coat's down, we can get to the really fun stuff of unmasking the solar panels. Fortunately, this Guns Metallic Black is nicely resistant to masking, so not a huge issue in just yanking the tape off. And here we are with all the tape removed. And frustratingly, from certain angles, you can still see echoes of the 3D print, which I just don't know how to deal with. But overall, these wings look pretty dang cool. And when we slap them onto the tie, it's really starting to look the business. So next up, it's time to go ahead and get the seat installed. And I'm going to be using Ammo's Black CA for that. It gives me a bit more working time to make sure everything is aligned. And yeah, it's not the prettiest glue job in the world, but I want it to hold. So it is in there, and I'm hesitant to move anything while it's drying, but trust me, it's in there. Okay, so we're coming up to a major moment of truth, and that is installing all of the transparencies into the canopy frame. Now, to make these, what I did is I actually took two different approaches. First of all, I took a bit of clear plastic from, I believe, a Hasegawa film sheet, and basically cut it and trimmed it until it fit one of these round windows, and then called it a day. I also set the frame itself down on a sheet of paper and basically with a pencil sketched out the opening for both the octagon and one of the round windows. Then I cut those out around the, leaving a little bit of margin around the outside of the markings, and kind of trimmed and trimmed and trimmed until they fit. Then I took those, scanned them in, took them into Illustrator, traced them, and then I cut them out on the silhouette. And I took a couple of different approaches with the actual material I was going to use for the transparencies. I had a piece of clear styrene that I managed to score pretty effectively, but cutting through it is a pain in the ass, and honestly, it's a bit dingy looking, and once the blade kind of gets over it, it's got scuffs on it, and just would rather not use it. And then I had some stuff I ordered from Amazon that was just too thin. It did cut, but it's flimsy, so it's like trying to put Ziploc bag transparencies in here. These are actually taken off of a sheet of overhead transparency paper, and they seem to work pretty decently. Anything bigger than this, I would be hesitant to use these for, but I think for the size, they will work. Now, installing these is going to be tricky because there is not a lot of space here, and the last thing I want is glue kind of spooging out around the clear parts and leaving unsightly marks. So it's possible to pretty easily position these things in here, but then how do we glue them? That's where the tricky stuff comes in. So for this, I'm going to try using Ultra Glue. I would thin it down, but I'm afraid if I thin it down, then that will kick the viscosity and it'll flow into the transparency areas where we do not want it at all. Instead, what I'm going to try doing here, just putting a dab along one side. Come on. Just kind of like that. Nothing fancy. And then just come in here. Once I've got that down, Son of a bitch. You can see why this is going to be a challenge. I'm going to have to go with my other option. Well, let's try to get a few of these placed, if nothing else. God damn it. This is a pain in the ass. Alright, you get the challenge. And doing this on camera is going to take forever. So I'm going to pause and figure this out and hop right back in. Okay, so I managed to get all of the panes installed, and it was a slow, tedious process involving brush painting, ultra glue on the backside of all the frames. And now I want to try to just guarantee that this thing isn't going to go anywhere. So I'm going to add something a little bit tougher. Okay, I think that's good enough. So this is UV clearing glue, so this is UV curing glue, which means we now go in and hit it with the ultraviolet light. And then we should have frames that are pretty well locked in place. At least locked in well enough to, be used in a model. Now, these are not perfect by any means. It's a good lesson for next time. But there you have it. Not perfect, but I will take it. Definitely adds another interesting visual layer. Okay, for the next step, I'm going to jump back to the ultra glue so that we can glue in the blast shield, instrument panel combing, whatever the hell you want to call it. Son of a bitch. I don't want it sitting that far back. New plan. Da-da-da-da. Because the fit is pretty janky, I am installing spacers. Now it remains to be seen how visible these are going to be, so let's find out. Cool. Check that out. Okay, the next bit of fun is going to be installing the framing. And for this, I'm just running ultra glue around the opening here. Doesn't need to be all over, just needs a decent amount of coverage. All right. go. That looks pretty damn cool. Next up, I'm going to mix up some epoxy, and we're going to glue the wings on. Woohoo! Okay, so epoxy has been mixed and applied, and now basically just letting the tie sit for several minutes and cure up. So when I started work on the TIE Interceptor, I didn't really have a firm fix on where I wanted. So when I first started work on this TIE Interceptor, I didn't have a firm fix on where I wanted it to end up. It was basically print, build, and complete my first 3D printed kit, and also participate in the Plastic Posse podcast TIE Fighter group build. Those were kind of the two things that kicked all this off. And yeah, I was kind of aiming for like a late Imperial, early Imperial remnant ship. But beyond that, I hadn't really thought in terms of the amount of weathering I was going to go after, whether I was going to have it be damaged or derelict or any of that kind of stuff. And I've sort of been playing around in my mind as I've gone along where I want to take it, how far I want to go. And as I slept on it last night, I decided that this is a pretty good place to leave it off. It's accomplished what I wanted to accomplish, which is printing, building, painting, and now completing my first 3D printed kit. So, a lot of great learning involved in that. It also is fairly beaten up for an active service tie. These things were generally pretty clean, and this thing is clean but also well used, I suppose. It's not rusting, it hasn't been languishing in a junkyard somewhere or caught up in sandstorms. This is just a hard-ridden TIE Interceptor. And so I think for my purposes of this, and just for all the stuff I want to do in the future, and knowing that the print itself is not perfect. I've got fucking cracks down here somehow. I've got some, weird waviness on some of the backside panel things here. Things could have gone better, but at the same time, it's a great learning experience, and it was also a great painting exercise to make what is essentially a very boring paint scheme, gray, rather interesting. The amount of depth packed into the gray on the cockpit ball, I'm pretty happy with. And I really like the contrast of the metallic black with the gray on the wings. It's got a darkness that I was going for, not too dark, but also not light and boring. This TIE Fighter definitely has some personality to it. So, with that, I'm going to call it a day on the actual TIE Interceptor itself, which leaves me with one more thing to do. The fucking stand. So, my issue with the stand is that it sucks in a number of ways. Hold on, there's a moth. So where was I? Oh yeah, the stand. So the stand sucks for a couple of reasons. First of all, I'm not a big fan of very obtrusive stands. And this thing, with its big-ass arms and everything, and this big stupid base, is obtrusive. It stands out, it gets in the way. Not cool. I would have much rather had, like a little pole that goes up into the bottom or the back of the TIE Interceptor to hold it up. But no, we get this big stupid column thing that refuses to print nicely. I even increased the size of the base in order to accommodate this thing, and it still just barely fits in there. Yay. But this thing is boring and stupid looking, and no matter what I've done to get it to print nicely, the thing is just, it's a big honking piece that doesn't really help anybody. Now, I have an idea to basically take this upper support area, probably slice it like right about here in Mesh Mixer, stick a cylinder on the bottom of it, and then run like a metal tube, almost like a hydraulic lift, out of that down to another thing in the base. And so it could be like a field deployment type of situation where it sits on a base and the base has like a walkway around it and ways to actually get into the TIE Interceptor. And in the center, we've got this, metal hydraulic pylon essentially plugging up into the bottom of this. Maybe some wiring running up along it as well. And the idea would be, it's on this desert planet or lava planet, whatever planet you want it to be. And, it sits on the ground as low as it can really get without the wings touching. It's got walkways around for pilots to get in, crew to service it, and then when it's ready to lift off, this thing lifts up and maybe even turns. And the tie's on it, and it goes, and then it does its screaming bullshit off into the horizon. That's my idea, but I am not really there in terms of 3D design. I mean, yeah, putting a cylinder on the bottom of this is easy. It's that base at the bottom, and it's the walkways, and, designing like walkways that look imperial and not bullshit. Getting walkways to print on a 3D printer. There are several hurdles that I need to get over before I, feel confident doing that. So for now, I've got this bullshit base. And obviously, I can't just leave it in like a hastily sanded resin thing. Like, that's not going to work, right? So I'm going to prime this and paint it like a dark blackish gray type color and call it a day. And that will be the final bit of this build. And the stand is sorted. So my order of operations to get to this point were first Guns Mr. Primer Surfacer 1000, which is really, really good over 3D printed things. It does a good job of helping to conceal some of the layer lines and various other surface fun that happens with 3D printing. That was followed by a coat of MRP Fine Surface Primer Black to basically cover up the really, really light gray of the primer surfacer, and then a coat of MRP tire rubber to give it that nice dirty gray appearance. So with that, the TIE Interceptor is wrapped for now. As I mentioned, I want to go back and redesign the stand and have some more fun with it than this current piece of crap. But I need to work on my design capabilities and also some of my 3D printing capabilities before I'm comfortable doing that. So for now, the Interceptor is going to live on this kind of janky stand. So there it is. My first 3D printed build is now in the past. It has been completed, and overall, I'm pretty happy with how it came out. I think I definitely could have pushed it further, both on the print and on the finish. But I also accomplished what I was setting out to do, which is print, build, paint, and complete my first 3D printed kit. And here it is. So that pretty much wraps things up. I hope you found this series useful and or entertaining, maybe some combination of the two, as an introduction to 3D printed kits, cleaning them up, painting TIE fighters, installing clear parts for canopy frames, pin washes, etc. Be sure to keep an eye out for more interesting projects coming down the pike in the near future. There's obviously the Tamiya P38F that is currently on the bench. There are some other 3D printed subjects on the way, including a quick little tease of, yes, that is not Boba Fett, that is Marshal Cobb Vanth from Season 2, Episode 1 of The Mandalorian. And if you happen to watch that, you probably have a good sense of what he's riding and what that means for the bench going forward. In addition to those things, there are other 3D printed subjects. There is armor coming, and there is probably a cool aircraft or two in the near future. So, thanks for watching. Again, hope this was useful, entertaining, etc., etc. And I will catch y'all later.